I was telling you guys that I'm particularly interested and moved by this organ because it's one that anatomists and philosophers and physicians or surgeons, since people were thinking and writing down their thoughts, were thinking about this. People knew from, the caveman days that when there was a threat, something happened here. They felt their heart racing, they felt their heart pounding. They knew that something important was here. And as time has gone by, we've learned more and more and more about the details of this. Back then, I think those people didn't care much about the pancreas and the bowel and all that stuff. But I think that the heart is something that has always been studied and always been thought about. And as we all know, it's it's sort of the seat, I sometimes ask students at the end to tell me what do they think is the most important organ. I don't know if there's an answer to it, but I will tell you that if the heart's not beating and doing its thing, soon nothing else will do its thing. These are our list of objectives for this unit. We're definitely not going to get to all of these. Almost definitely, we are not going to discuss the cardiac cycle because it's more a topic for physiology than us anyway, and probably will not have time for it. How the heart and the heart rate is influenced by the autonomic nervous system is probably something that we will cover in the nervous system chapter. Probably not something we'll get to, but we will see. What remains is a pretty long list, but I just want to remind you that some of these things you already know. Some of these things are very short and sweet, and of course some are a little more complicated. When I think of, when I think of the heart and the cardiovascular system, sometimes it's called the circulatory system. We have the center of the system, it's the heart. The heart is a pump. A pump is something that moves liquid. And the heart moves liquid, but instead of a pump like in a pool or one of those fountains outside that continuously squirts water out, the heart pumps blood intermittently in bursts, in globs, in little blobs, pump, pump, pump at a time. And the circulatory system is definitely a circle. It's definitely a circuit. In the most simple drawing, there's a point A and a point B. It is more complicated than that, and I'll tell you. But by and by, if you start in one point along this track, you'll end up at the same point eventually in the healthy cardiovascular system. And importantly, this is a one-way street all the way through. In the healthy heart, in the healthy body, things move in one direction. They do not go in reverse. Some disease processes cause this system to go in reverse, but definitely not in the normal anatomy and physiology. So if I said to somebody on an airplane or in an elevator, what is the heart? I'd say the heart is a pump that pushes liquid through a series of plumbing, through a series of hollow tubes, empty hollow tubes. So that's what I say what I mean when I say the heart keeps blood in motion. Definitely, if blood stops moving, all hell breaks loose. Because the purpose of blood is to bring oxygen to the tissues. Specifically to bring oxygen to the mitochondria so that they can synthesize ATP. But there are a number of reasons why you want oxygen to reach your tissues. And in a bacteria, oxygen can enter that cell, and a bacteria is one single cell, and it gets its oxygen through its cell membrane and is happy. But in us, there's too much real estate for oxygen to just float from the lungs to where it needs to go. We have to have a railroad system, we have to have a delivery system, and that's what this is. The heart beats 100,000 times a day. Most of us heart beats 70 to 90 beats a minute. Minute in and minute out, 24 hours a day for 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 years without stopping. And it's a muscle. And when I say it's a muscle, what I mean is it's a collection of a bunch of individual cardiac muscle cells. And a muscle cell, whether it's skeletal or cardiac or smooth, possesses the capability of literally shortening. When a muscle shortens, we call it contracting, but that's what contraction is, it's shortening. And because we have a line of these connected to each other, and that at each end they're attached to something else, when muscle tissue shortens, it pulls things together and it pulls on things. In the case of the heart, what we have is a hollow organ, and when these muscle cells shorten and contract together, it squeezes on that hollow space and it pushes any fluid out. Just like if you squeezed a water balloon or a juice box or something like that. Oh, that's a nice picture. Squeeze a juice box. Imagine doing 100,000 bicep curls in a day, or 100,000 squats, or 100,000 crunches. No way. Our skeletal muscle gets fatigued, obviously. We all know that. This muscle doesn't get fatigued, not in the same way. It's able to do this reliably, without us telling it to, without the nervous system telling it to. These cells are able to initiate each heartbeat on its own, and it does its thing, to the tune of almost 3 gallons a minute from point A to point B. Amazing, 1.5 million gallons a year. Pretty cool. The book says the heart's the size of a clenched fist. To me, my experience, it's a little larger than that, but it's close. A diseased heart can grow to a tremendous size. It's called cardiomegaly, enlarged heart. But the healthy hearts are about the size of a clenched fist, or a little bigger. And what it is it's a house with 4 rooms. There are 4 empty chambers. And there are 2 chambers above, 2 superior chambers. Those are called atria. These are the upper chambers of the superior chambers. There's a right and a left, and there's 2 below. These are called ventricles. The ventricles are the inferior chambers, and the atria are the superior chambers. And there's a right ventricle and a left ventricle. Patient's right, patient's left. And there's a right atrium and a left atrium. Remember, the atria is superior. I sometimes find it really useful to color code my notes. Something about remembering a particular word is written in green helps. I don't know, it's something you guys might try if you've never tried it. They used to make fun of me because I'd have 25 pens laid out in front of me in class, but it worked for me. This we'll get into a little bit later, but there are 2 circuits in the circulatory system. What it means is there's a track where you could walk or run laps on a track in a circle. There are a couple of tracks in the body. One of these carries blood to the lungs to dispose of carbon dioxide, crud, and to receive a new shipment of fresh, beautiful oxygen. And then it takes that blood back to the heart. That's called the pulmonary circuit. In the systemic circuit, the part of the heart that's received that pretty red oxygenated blood carries it out to the body, out to the fingers and toes, and to the guts, and up to the brain. That's called the systemic circuit. On the other side of this,
Are we going to discuss and will be responsible for, I forget this is the name of the fetal circuit?
The answer is no. He's asking about the fetal circulation, which is different. The way our blood circulates when we're inside the womb is pretty different than as adults. The blood bypasses the lungs because we're totally engulfed in water, and the liver as well. So it's a pretty different setup. I'm not going to test you on it. It's pretty interesting. Once you get this down pat, it's pretty cool to kind of understand how that's changed. But no. that won't be for us right now. So the systemic circuit carries beautiful oxygenated blood out to the fingers and the toes. And then that blood kind of switches directions and it's returned to the heart and to the lungs to receive new oxygen. If you just looked at the heart from the outside and you hadn't heard anything else about it, you might think it's like a balloon, one big space inside. You can't exactly tell from the outside that there's 4 chambers, but there are some clues. There are some grooves that run sort of in a transverse plane that separate atria from ventricle. There are as well some grooves that separate the right and left ventricles. Okay? And we get a clue because there are these sort of indentations or grooves on the outside of the heart that are full of golden fat, this adipose tissue. There's big blood vessels running through those grooves. So it kind of tells you there's a separation here between the right and the left ventricle. There's a separation over here between the right atrium and the right ventricle. These things are called sulci or sulcuses. A sulcus is a groove, and there are a couple of different grooves on the outside of the heart. Within those grooves run the big blood vessels that bring blood to the heart itself. And those blood vessels are sort of caked in fat, or kind of like surrounded in globs of fat. And that's what we're seeing in this picture. This is a little bit of a complicated diagram that shows the pulmonary and the systemic circuits. The pulmonary circuit really starts on the right side of the heart. And the right side of the heart, if you can imagine this 4 chambers, the right 2 chambers work together to send blood over to the lungs. There, the blood is recharged with oxygen, sent back to the left side of the heart. The left chambers, the left atrium and the left ventricle work together to send blood out to the rest of the body. So from the left side of the heart, blood goes out. There it enters veins. It comes back to the right heart. From the right heart, goes to the lungs to get recharged with oxygen. Back to the left heart. There it's pumped out, goes out to the body, drops off its oxygen, starts returning to the heart as oxygen poor venous blood. And that's the sort of the cycle. One way, one direction. Arteries, a lot of us have heard of arteries before, and we think of red blood vessels on a diagram. I do not want you to think of arteries as the red things. I don't want you to think of arteries as the things full of oxygen. I want you to think of arteries as things that are going away from the heart. Because some arteries contain oxygen-poor blood. Some arteries are purple on diagrams. So the best way to learn these reliably is to learn that arteries mean that they carry blood away from the heart. Same kind of thing for veins. A lot of people think of blue veins, and most of the veins on diagrams are blue, but that's not complete. Veins are vessels that carry blood back to the heart. These are things that are returning to the heart. The pulmonary veins are carrying bright red, oxygen-rich blood back to the heart, and they're veins, but on the pictures they're red, they're full of oxygen. So color and oxygen is not the clue. It's not the way. It can trip you up. But categorically, arteries carry blood away from the heart, and veins do the opposite. Capillaries are what we call the very smallest blood vessels in the body. If you filled the arteries with concrete and melted the rest of the body away with acid, you would see big arteries that get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until they're microscopic, even smaller than a single red blood cell's width. Red blood cells have to fold themselves up to get through capillaries, as small as can be. And those we call capillaries. And when you guys think of capillaries, I want you to think of a network of little teensy blood vessels that start as arteries, and they have an artery side, but at one point they transition. And instead of being arteries that are going away from the heart, they become veins that are going back to the heart. And that transition occurs in a capillary bed. So capillaries, they're not red, they're not blue, really they're somewhere in between. They're things like this that are passing through in one direction, starting big, branching smaller, and then those small branches blend together to form bigger and bigger and bigger veins. Hmm?
I was curious, since you're a surgeon maybe now, with, like with capillaries, when you're doing surgery, like obviously, unless you're specifically trying to like open up an artery or you're blocking or something, like try not to cut the arteries and things and stuff. But with capillaries, I imagine it's almost unavoidable if you're gonna cut some.
Yes.
How do you like reconcile that when you're, stitching something back up so that they don't
Sure.
lose blood flow?
It's definitely unavoidable to divide capillaries during the course of any operation. But there are so many millions of capillary beds that, depending on what you're doing, blood vessels have the ability to kind of grow out and reach out and clasp back onto tissues during the healing process, one. Two, these days we use an electric scalpel called a Bovie that burns through tissues as we go. And so it would be unusual to see capillary bleeding if you're coming through tissue with a Bovie, if you're going slow and doing what you need to do. And so we sacrifice capillaries for the sake of a greater good. As you said, we definitely avoid larger named arteries. Sometimes we have to tie those off and sacrifice them. Sometimes that's okay. Sometimes things need to be, dealt with and receive new blood. But usually when you're operating, you're taking something out. And so you don't care if its blood supply has been disrupted. As a matter of fact, it's often important to control that bleeding and to occlude those big blood vessels so that when you leave, the patient's not bleeding. Yeah, it's a good question. Certainly, if you cut someone with a scalpel and look at the cut edge of skin, for instance, or things like that, you would see sort of a slow ooze of blood coming out, and that would be from the capillary level. If you're using an electric scalpel, those things are going to be cauterized before you ever knew they were there.
What about for like finer, forming stuff? I know you were a general surgeon, right? But what about for like finer stuff, like, I know the neurosurgeons have to worry about like all the, blood vessels in the brain and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely sew together or anastomose small vessels, but definitely never at the capillary level. Nobody these days are sewing capillaries together. Maybe someday. You guys have already learned about the pericardium, specifically the serous pericardium. There's a visceral layer that's slapped and smacked and glued onto the heart. That's the visceral layer. In the heart, it's nicknamed the epicardium. Same thing. There's an outer parietal layer, and between those two is a cavity or a space. That's the pericardial cavity. But there's also this thing called the fibrous pericardium. It's the outermost, really durable and tough sac that the heart sits in. On the deep internal surface of the fibrous pericardium is the visceral pericardium, and there's a space, then you've got the heart with the visceral pericardium attached. In this picture, we see some fibrous pericardium out here. As well, there's inside the parietal pericardium, and then this white line here represents the visceral pericardium. Okay, we've seen this picture before. If you kind of took a biopsy of the wall of the heart and looked at it, you'd see the heart wall is not just one thing, but it's several layers. Kind of like if you cut a Snickers bar in half, there's chocolate, there's don't know, caramel, right, and something else, nougat, whatever, you get what I'm saying. There's layers to it. The outermost layer we see here, this is the fibrous and the parietal pericardium. This golden layer here is the visceral pericardium, also called the epicardium. This thick layer, this is where all the cardiac muscle cells live. We call it the myocardium. MYO means muscle. This is the thick muscular layer of the heart wall. These are the branching cardiac muscle cells that you guys have already seen. They're connected to one another by these dark intercalated discs. Extensive branching. Many, many cells communicating with one another so that when they go to contract, the command to contract can spread almost immediately to all of the cells at once so they can contract in unison. Very nice. Finally, the innermost layer is called the endocardium. It's a layer of simple squamous epithelium, a single layer of flat, fried egg-shaped cells. And you see some of those here. And then if you look from the side, the cut edge will be flat. Okay. Remember we saw the blood vessels kind of laid across or draped across the outside of the heart? These blood vessels are kind of draped across the external part of the heart, and they pierce the heart wall. And they travel inward, supply the myocardium, supply the endocardium. Do you guys think the endothelium has blood vessels that travel into it? Yeah. Endothelium is an example of epithelial tissue. It's avascular. But there are certainly blood vessels running through this connective tissue here. It's areolar connective tissue. Those nutrients can go and supply those epithelial cells, and they do. This is stuff you already know, but I'm just reminding you that the outrageous abundance of mitochondria in this tissue is what allows these things to contract day in and day out so frequently. When our skeletal muscle might get fatigued, there is an immense number of mitochondria in cardiac muscle tissue, and they perform this process known as aerobic respiration, which by and by produces the energy source for those cells, ATP. Very extensive blood supply. Catastrophic when that blood supply is blocked off. What is the disease called when a heart's blood supply is blocked off? Not exactly. That can lead to the thing I'm thinking of. In the medical world, we call it myocardial infarction, an MI. It's commonly called a heart attack. When the blood supply to the heart is pinched off or occluded somehow by a blood clot or by a plaque of cholesterol, it's called a myocardial infarction. Remember, the myocardium is the muscle layer. Infarction means dead or dying. It means dead. Things die when their blood supply gets cut off. So interrupting the blood supply to the cardiac myocytes is not great. This can happen in a small, limited way. This can happen in a huge territory. And what happens to the patient depends on how many muscle cells die. These cells, of course, are involuntary. This says without information from the nervous system. There's no nerve that travels to the heart and says, bzz, contract, bzz, contract. The stimulus to contract arises from special muscle cells that have the ability to initiate a wave of contraction themselves. It's remarkable. It's amazing. And it's possible because each of these cells are interconnected by these gap junctions known as intercalated discs. We've already seen this. Here's cell A, here's cell B. Suppose A is able to prompt itself to contract. To its neighboring cell, it can go, you contract. And then B can say to its neighbors, you guys contract. And that wave of contraction spreads through the entire organ starting here, spreading across the atria, down to this junction between the atrium and ventricle and the center of the heart, down the middle and up each side, quite rapidly. I mean, feel your heartbeat. The arrows I just drew occur every time the heart beats. This is what's happening. It's really a very efficient process. Pretty cool. This is how the heart sits in the chest. Not perfectly straight on with the right atria here and the left atria here and the right ventricle here and the left ventricle here. That whole thing is pointed forward and laterally to the left. It's also twisted a bit counterclockwise. And so if you were to stab someone in the chest, probably the thing you'd hit first is the right ventricle. LV is over here. Left atrium is the most internal and protected, and right atrium is up here. Left atrium is facing almost perfectly posteriorly. In fact, if you put an ultrasound probe down the esophagus runs right behind the heart, and you can get a great view of the left atrium from inside the esophagus, but by putting a little ultrasound probe through, it's called a transesophageal echocardiogram, TEE. It's a great way to look at the left atrium, if you're into that sort of thing. There are grooves and sulcuses in the heart I told you about. There's a sulcus that runs in this sort of transverse direction. It's called the coronary sulcus. It separates atria from ventricle. There's a sulcus that runs vertically, quote unquote. It separates right ventricle from left ventricle. There's also a small intra-atrial sulcus. Okay. The important thing here is that these are grooves where the blood vessels travel. And so during a dissection or during an operation, if you see a big blob of adipose tissue, this golden fat, you know the blood vessels are running through there. That's how you find them. More or less. So again, the atria are superior. They're thin walls because from the atria to the ventricles, to pump the blood from here to here, you're just going next door. It doesn't have to be very strong. It's just a and it's there. Ventricles, on the other hand, these inferior chambers, these are thick. The walls of these are thick, especially the left ventricle, because these have to send the blood a longer distance. These are worked out harder, and so they develop more, just like any muscle. The left ventricular wall is the side that deals with the systemic circuit. The left ventricle has to be able to pump blood clear down to the toes and out to the fingertips. So that's the strongest and most juicy part of the heart. The right ventricle sends blood to the lungs. It's really down the road. It doesn't have to travel a very long distance. So the RV is definitely thinner than the left ventricle. And if you cut the thing in half, like we're going to be doing soon in our dissection, then you can really start to see the chambers and the walls that separate the four chambers from one another. There's a vertical wall. These walls are called septum. There's an interventricular septum. There's an interatrial septum. These separate left heart from right heart. Okay? See how thick the ventricular septum is. See how thick the left ventricle is compared to the right ventricle. Big difference. And then look at the right atrium. Right ventricle wall. V thin. Also, the arrows on this diagram remind us that blood travels through the heart and the blood vessels everywhere in the body in one direction. One-way street. When things start to not flow in the right direction, many different problems can ensue depending on where you are. Bad. Bad. Okay? We must stop because it's time to stop. I'm sorry again for telling you to preview the wrong thing. That was poor attention to detail on my part, and It'll still serve you well, but it didn't serve its intended purpose, I'm sorry. What we're gonna be doing the rest of today is we'll meet in the lab at the usual time, which is 7. We'll go over the lab exam. We'll go over it pretty quickly because I have copies of your guys' lab exam, so I can give you your original and you can keep it. You can compare it to the key that I'm gonna post on Blackboard. If I've made any mistakes, you can email me. And, you know, if there's any disputes or confusion or whatever, we can talk about it then. Then, the rest of the time, we're gonna use the heart models and start to figure out the heart models, some of the structures we talked about. I am gonna take a few minutes of your lab time to kind of walk you through the models and talk about some of the things we didn't get to. I do not like lecturing in lab, but on exam days, I take that trade-off because it's important to me for you guys to go over the exam and do that process, okay? Questions about the heart so far?
We have time to answer before we're getting out of here.
Fine.
You said that the heart gets a signal to contract from like action, like from nerves or I thought that.
Well, from specialized muscle cells, but go ahead.
Okay, I thought that cluster of specialized muscle cells or whatever, that it receives its signal from the brain. And it has its own signal. They're synced up. When you get like a AFib or AFib or whatever, that's like the two right? So they are getting.
The nervous system can influence the heart rate. It can cause those pacemaker cells to fire more frequently or less. However, without any input from the nervous system, the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, those collections of special cells are capable of, it's called automaticity, it's a property of cardiac muscle tissue. They're able to initiate a heartbeat all by themselves without any input from the nervous system. Now, the vagus nerve and other nervous input can speed up or slow down the heart rate,
Yeah.
but it's not required to beat.
But I mean, if you have a big brain hit, there are some beat on its own, right? They still need to like
Yes, it will. Sure, independent, yeah. There are definitely patients who, you know, you could diagnose with clinical brain death, whose blood is still circulating, sure, whose blood is still circulating. Now, like, frank brainstem dysfunction at that level, is a different story. However, I'll tell you, the area you're thinking of, the heart rate centers and the respiratory centers, but again, the cardiac muscle tissue has the ability to beat, and it does. And in fact, when an organ